Great, thanks, Steph. That was such a great intro. And hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you all today. As Stephanie mentioned, today marks our final session of our spring series on demography. So today we're going to be talking about some of the global solutions that we can implement in order to facilitate a more sustainable future. A lot of the presentation is going to be spent weaving together much of what we've been learning with the hopes of setting a proper foundation for talking through the various solutions that we're going to propose in terms of upholding human rights, addressing climate mitigation and adaptation, advancing social justice, and so on, all under the broader umbrella of women's empowerment. And really the intention here is to kind of get us thinking about and really working to promote integrated developmental and climate solutions that simultaneously address social, economic, and political issues within societies. In my opinion, solving the climate crisis is absolutely contingent upon the widespread implementation of such integrated solutions as well as systemic change. As always, though, I'm going to leave things pretty open-ended, both because, we don't actually know what's going to happen in the future, and I certainly don't presume to know either. And also because, we want to hear from you about what you think the best way forward is for our future and why. So one thing's for sure, and that's that we've got a lot of really complex global issues ahead of us that are quite imminent. And addressing them is going to undoubtedly require a really comprehensive and multifaceted approach. So we look forward, as usual, to an engaging discussion. Next slide, please, Steph. So over the past few months, we've been diving into some of the main foundational tenets of demography as it relates to population and the environment. So we've looked at the history of population growth worldwide and the various shifts that humanity has undergone in accordance with other social, political, and economic changes, which have ultimately contributed to massive increases in population growth all across the world, with varying implications for the environment and social progress. Next slide, please. The advancements put forth by the Industrial Revolution in particular, which occurred very recently within the context of human history, really set the groundwork for rapid increases in population growth as more tools and services became available for people at large to augment their living standards through increases in livelihoods, better access to sanitation and public healthcare services, advancements in food production and technology, and so on. So following the Industrial Revolution, the size of the world's population has increased really drastically. So remember, for tens of thousands of years, the population grew really slowly. And then within less than 300 years, the number of people has mushroomed to almost 8 billion people. This period also marks the global transition to dependence on fossil fuel resources, which have combined with a progressively globalized, consumption-based economy to cause really large-scale environmental degradation, as well as the climate crisis. Next slide. In addition to the Industrial Revolution, globalization has also helped propel the world's population forward at progressively faster rates. So while the Industrial Revolution really helped death rates to fall in the 18th and 19th centuries, first in Europe and then throughout North America, which were the more affluent regions of the Western world, globalization in turn helped reduce death rates in countries all over the world, specifically following World War II and regardless of socioeconomic status. And this occurred because of the widespread application of technological advances in medicine and public health, particularly vaccines, and also because of the Green Revolution in agriculture, which facilitated massive increases in crop yields and better production of food globally in terms of output. Importantly, this didn't necessarily happen because of what was going on internally within these countries with regards to resource allocation and distribution. So this is one reason why, low-income countries are still struggling with rapid population growth and have for a really long time. Next slide. So along with the global context for population growth, we've been learning more about the different pathways and trajectories that countries typically undergo as they develop socially, politically, and economically. A demographic perspective allows us to understand the ways in which population growth relates to developmental indicators, which signify things like social progress, economic growth, political stability, and even happiness to a certain extent, although that metric is kind of contentious. But throughout most of human history, both fertility rates and death rates were high, which accounted for a pretty slow population growth overall. And again, the real precursor for population growth has come from increases in longevity and decreases in death rates, especially as the latter relates to maternal and infant mortality. Increases in longevity are afforded through better living standards, access to resources like healthcare, potable water, education, sanitation, technology, and other innovations typically associated with what's understood as developmental progress. These social services and benefits typically accompany industrialization because, in theory, that process facilitates affluence and allows countries and governments to become better equipped to help their populations transcend poverty and better their health outcomes, increase education rates, and so on. Next slide. So you'll recall these graphs, which I've used often to exemplify this point, which is that there's a direct relationship between education rates and overall fertility, in that women who are educated tend to have fewer, healthier children. This also relates very closely to socioeconomic status in healthcare, because women who are healthier can take more years of school, and also because family planning allows for women and girls to better access what's called informed choice, which of course leads to lower fertility rates over time. Better health outcomes are also an indication of lower poverty overall. Next slide. And it's also worth noting, however, that industrialization has not occurred evenly everywhere, and that there are many countries that are still in like pre-industrial or post-industrial or in the process of industrializing. This discrepancy is really tightly bound to colonialism in both historical and contemporary contexts, and is the cause of a lot of inequality globally and at all social scales. And by the way, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the creator of these wonderful slides and graphs, our fellow Alex. She's worked really hard creating these population pyramids, much of which I'm going to feature in this presentation today, and a series of maps that follow that. And yeah, I think that you've made the presentation so much better. So thank you. Shout out to Alex. But in terms of population and from a sociopolitical perspective, we can say first that there's a direct link between development and age structure at the country level, in that the world's most affluent societies, which were also mostly the early industrializers, at present have old or aging populations. A commonly cited example of an aging population is that of Japan, which has a disproportionately high amount of older citizens relative to younger citizens. This is creating a lot of worry amongst economists and the Japanese government more broadly, and it's something that we'll hopefully revisit later on in the presentation if we have time, and if not, for sure during the discussion. Also worth noting here that these populations, aging populations in sort of post-industrialized countries, are also super high-level consumers. Next slide. The United States is another example of what's known as an aging population, as you can see, because we're entering an age where fertility rates will continue to drop, in theory, because family sizes will progressively get smaller and smaller in accordance with the country's provision of social services, along with the safety and economic stability that presumably encourages people, and women in particular, to go to school for longer, to get more degrees at higher levels, and to really invest in their careers. This equates to marrying later and ultimately having fewer children. And this has been happening for a while, actually, in the United States, but our fertility rates have remained just above or at replacement level because of immigration, which, by the way, has really helped our economy in comparison to that of Japan, for example. But on the other hand, I think many people would argue, and I agree, that the social, political, and economic climate in the United States is not actually encouraging people to pursue the American dream or to really invest in their careers in order to achieve any certain goals like buying a house or starting a family. But rather, people are working harder and harder just to survive, let alone buy a house, start a family, or even like afford to own a dog. Because wealth disparities are really getting much bigger between the rich and the poor. Wages are not increasing despite higher housing prices. Inflation is crazy, the pandemic, climate change, you name it. Some would call this also the inevitable progression of deregulated capitalism, but we won't get too much into that. Also worth noting is that these population projections are based on historical data, which assumes all of the aforementioned social dynamics to be true. It's quite unusual for an industrialized, seemingly progressive country like ours to reverse its stance on abortion. And of course, we don't know exactly what that's going to mean at the population level, aside from the very real certainty that unintended pregnancies will rise, likely alongside higher teen pregnancy rates, and that more women, especially low-income Black, Brown, and Indigenous women, will now die from unsafe abortions at much higher levels. We can talk about this more in the discussion, but I just wanted to be sure to make a note here that these are in fact projections. That said, I think that in terms of the age structure and the projections into the future, I don't think it's going to change all that much, but who knows? We'll see, I guess. Next slide. And in the middle of the spectrum, we have low to middle income countries, many of which are in the process of transitioning from high to low fertility rates and are achieving slower population growth, but still growing very quickly, some countries more so than others. These countries, including Bangladesh, which is featured here, are rapidly industrializing alongside steady population growth rates. These countries encompass 5 billion people, or 80% of the world's population. So in these contexts, processes of industrialization are simultaneously driving economic growth and social progress, while also contributing to the production of greenhouse gas emissions at some of the highest levels during a country's growth trajectory. And on the other side of the climate change coin, Bangladesh is also extremely climate vulnerable, as are many countries in similar positions, which means that they are working to industrialize and increase standards of living and sort of progress their societies amidst unpredictable weather patterns and extremes that they are not responsible for. So this is also very much a climate justice issue. Next slide. And also the countries that are in early or even pre-industrial stages of development are also low income at the state and individual levels. And from a population perspective, these age structures are quite young because life expectancy is lower, access to resources is limited, women and girls are not generally attending school for very long or able to participate in the economy at equitable, progressive levels, and so on. Remember also that there's a really close connection between fertility rates and poverty, which means that low-income countries that are pre-industrial have really high population growth rates. Uganda is an example of a country with a really young population, and as you can see, it's been young for quite a long time. So it's really crucial that this country invests in health and education and works to help its population transcend poverty in order to harness the demographic dividends and really propel its economy and society forward. There's a lot of different challenges that this country faces just from having such a huge young population. Next slide. Nigeria is in a really similar position in terms of age structure. So as you can see, it's remained young for a very long time. It's still in that sort of low income status. But in terms of population, it is going to be one of the very highest. I think it's going to surpass that of the United States pretty soon. So again, in these countries, it's really, really important that countries invest in services that will allow its citizens to transcend poverty and to access resources at a level that will create a better environmental, social, and economic situation for the country's people. Next slide, please. And these maps were made by Alex again, and they just provide a really great sort of visual of what we've been talking about. So here you'll see, percentage of population under 15. The majority of these populations reside in Africa and Saharan Africa, also parts of the Middle East, some parts of Central America, and Latin America overall. And next slide, please. So this coincides very neatly with full fertility rates. As you can see, the sort of same trends continue. Next slide, please. And also, if we look at the percentage of the population living below the poverty line, you can see again a real convergence of young age structures, high fertility, and poverty. And if we included climate vulnerability here, the trend would be no different. So these are sort of compounding issues that are exacerbated by population growth that are preventing development and really increasing vulnerability at social, economic, and environmental scales. Next slide, please. And in terms of the environment, we can see this play out in sync with everything we've kind of covered so far. So it makes sense that the industrialized countries with aging populations have much higher carbon footprints than low-income countries with young age structures. In fact, there's a really huge disparity here that's worth noting and really understanding deeply as we delve into the very tricky territory of population and the environment. In fact, around 50% of consumption-related emissions come from 10% of the world's people. So really, whenever we're looking at population and the environment, we need to pay very close attention to the way that resources are used and consumed and the disparities that exist globally with regards to access to resources, poverty, access to capital, and so on. Next slide. These discrepancies also exist at the country level as well. The United States represents 5% of the global population, but consumes about 24% of the planet's resources. And as we talked about in session 2, there's a real relationship here between development and the environment that needs to be taken very seriously, so long as we continue to rely on dirty fossil fuels, unsustainable food production practices, and extractive industries. Absolutely, high consuming countries need to shift away from consuming at really, really high rates and towards renewable resources, lower consumption patterns, and lowering carbon footprints. Absolutely, that's very true. Also, if we look, from a population perspective and recognize that 80% of the world's 8 billion people currently lives in a society that's rapidly industrializing, we'll see that emissions in places like Brazil and China and India and Indonesia and Nigeria are surging while their populations can continue to grow rapidly alongside increases in demand for commodities like meat, cars, travel, and so on. Many of these populations will continue to grow for the next several generations, no matter what, despite any alterations to fertility levels that are made now. And this is due to what's called demographic momentum, meaning that even as fertility rates fall below replacement levels, large numbers of young people will continue to boost the country's population for a few generations. And a few generations, excuse me. And to be clear, everyone deserves the ability to increase their consumption rates and live more comfortable lives. This is not what we're talking about. We're talking about what are the environmental implications of so many people sort of depending on an economy that is inherently unsustainable and that is causing the destruction of our planet. Next slide, please. And as for the low consuming countries that are growing quickly despite limited access to capital, resources, or government support, slowing population growth and harnessing the power of the demographic dividend is absolutely vital for progress and prosperity, but also increasingly precarious in the wake of these intersecting and seemingly interminable global threats we face. And in all cases, securing and expanding access to healthcare and education and the empowerment of women to lead healthy, autonomous lives is one of the fundamental elements of any sort of social, economic, or environmental progress. This is true across the board, everywhere, regardless of economic status, developmental trajectory, age structure, or anything else. Next slide. First and foremost, all women deserve access to basic human rights, period, and full stop, to quote our CEO during a meeting yesterday. He said it like that, and I liked it. And while there are myriad societal benefits that coincide with better access, equity, and engagement by women, the value of women's empowerment cannot be reduced to metrics. These are people that we're talking about here, right? In an excerpt from Paul Hawkins' Regeneration, Sterling and Winthrop, who were two researchers who actually wrote a book on the economic and social value of girls' education, also note that, we shouldn't need a book on girls' education. Respect and inclusion are common sense, deeply human, and obvious. And the same goes for family planning, as there are few rights more fundamental than the ability to choose when, whether, and with whom to have children. Next slide. By increasing access to education and healthcare, societies can more effectively develop and also slow population growth, which relieves environmental and social and political also pressure. In India, which is a country of almost 1.4 billion people and one set to become the most populous nation in the world by 2027, the population growth rate has actually been slowing for the past few decades, primarily because of the alleviation of poverty, rising education levels, especially among women, and growing urbanization. Most Indian states, as you can see on the right picture on the right-hand side, have already reached replacement level fertility, even despite setbacks from the coronavirus. And the country overall has actually reached replacement level fertility for the first time ever. Again, this is largely due to the expansion of healthcare, education, and opportunity for the country's citizens, especially its women and girls. Still, fertility rates remain above average in a few states, including some of the poorest. And India overall has a really high unmet need for modern contraceptive methods and still relies intermittently on sterilizing women through incentives and proposed population policies. This is one reason why it's so important to approach the concept of population and population stabilization sensitively and from a human rights perspective. This kind of stuff is happening today, not 10 years ago, not a few generations ago, right now. Next slide. And to be just crystal clear about the benefits associated with health and education, we can take a look at this slide here, which shows that access to sexual and reproductive health care yields a ton of different benefits to society and ultimately can influence population dynamics through voluntary reductions in fertility and lower infant and maternal mortality rates. Additionally, comprehensive reproductive health care increases the health, welfare, and life expectancy of women and children, advances individuals' rights, reduces poverty, and slows population growth. And together, these benefits really help to strengthen environmental sustainability and state stability. I mean, just look at all of the benefits associated with simply just giving people access to the basic human right that allows them the opportunity to choose when, whether, and with whom to become pregnant. It's really compelling. Next slide. And coupled very essentially with family planning services is education. So it's common to see the two grouped together in different developmental solutions or strategies because they clearly complement each other, but they also in very many ways co-constitute one another. So it's not usually enough to just go into a region and increase access to family planning, right? It's just as important that women and girls especially, but also men and boys and societies at large are educated because among many other things, it really facilitates informed or even critical thought, which is really necessary in confronting some of the cultural or patriarchal barriers that might otherwise prevent people from utilizing such an advantageous resource like that of family planning. But when education levels rise for women and girls in particular, they gain social, political, and economic power. So higher levels of education afford more options for sustained employment and helps increase livelihoods. And given this information, it's really no surprise that women who are educated tend statistically to have fewer, healthier children. Expanding access to education is incredibly important for any society, but it's a particularly vital component for sustainable development in low resource settings that are also climate vulnerable, which also already face the biggest structural barriers to both getting an education and to family planning. Next slide. And this map shows years of education overlaid with unmet need for family planning. As you can see, again, these are really converging issues that deserve our urgent attention as we work to envision and create a more sustainable future. Thanks again, Alex, for that map. Don't leave us. Okay, next slide. So there's a lot of evidence showing that an educated populace of women drastically reduces infant mortality, child marriage, family size, malaria, and HIV and AIDS. Conversely, as Project Drawdown cites, educated women result in improved health, economic well-being, higher agricultural yields, and social stability. When women are forced, however, into child marriage, they have an average of about 5 children. They typically lack access to family planning, and their children have poor outcomes. Girls who complete the equivalent of a high school education, however, have an average of 2 children. They earn higher wages, and they create opportunities that are passed down to their children. These benefits, therefore, compound over time and across generations and act as sort of a virtuous cycle where girls are supported to continue their education without pressure to work or support their families. Right now, there are 130 million girls worldwide that are denied the basic human right to attend school. Next slide. Climate change, the pandemic, wars, and other crises disproportionately impact the world's women and girls. Women and girls face a greater risk of displacement and are more likely to be injured or killed by natural disasters. Climate impacts like prolonged drought and unpredictable rainy seasons have already proven to increase the incidence of child marriage and the likelihood of being pushed into prostitution. Girls are more likely to leave school prematurely in response to climate-induced natural disasters and the many ancillary social and economic issues that coincide with a warming planet. The list goes on and on. The report is virtually everywhere, and with anything, women and girls are disproportionately affected. According to the UN, 650 million women who are alive today are married as children, and each year over 12 million girls are married before they reach their 18th birthday. This number is increasing because of climate change. Malawi, for example, where there's a particularly pervasive issue, there are about 4 or 5 million girls at risk of being married each year, and out of the number, 1.5 million risk marriage specifically because of climate change related events. Next slide. The climate crisis also impacts reproductive health and rights. These effects materialize in the form of reduced or unavailable services in areas affected by disaster, or harmful impacts on maternal health due to heat exposure, or increased incidence of sexual and gender-based violence in situations of humanitarian crises and displacement. So as the impacts of the climate crisis become more severe, adverse outcomes for sexual and reproductive health and rights will only increase. Inequality and marginalization magnify these vulnerabilities and put people at risk. So addressing gender inequality and other forms of marginalization is really crucial for reducing vulnerability and enhancing resilience. Next slide. And worldwide, there's a confluence of these structural issues that countries face as they attempt to develop amidst a rapidly changing climate, fast population growth rates, limits in access to resources, and so on. This is a point that I clearly want to emphasize because these issues are caused by injustices. They prevent development, subjugate populations, increase vulnerability to climate change, and ultimately reduce our collective resilience to the challenges we face as a global community, both now and into the future. Next slide. So in opposition to all of this, we can work to actually uplift people. And this is a really effective solution. You know, one of such is just the empowerment of women through agriculture. One of the biggest challenges we face as a growing global population is food production and the fact that large-scale deforestation occurs as a result, which among many other things increases emissions and worsens climate change. And lo and behold, women farmers produce a huge amount of the world's food. In fact, women produce 60 to 80% of food in lower income countries. Typically, these women are what are known as smallholders because they work on small parcels of land. But because of gender inequality, they have less access to resources like land rights or credit, capital, technology, or training in comparison to men, and thus end up producing less food. Research, again from Project Drawdown, my favorite organization, shows that if these gaps are closed, farm yields would rise by up to 30%, meaning that 30% more food could be produced on the same amount of land. This would also reduce malnutrition by up to 17% globally. Boosting yields of women farmers also helps keep forests intact because farmers are less inclined to expand their crops into nearby forests when their existing land is productive. In terms of mitigation, simply leveling the playing field for women farmers could reduce up to 2 gigatons of CO2 by 2050 alone. And for the 3.5 billion people who currently live in rural areas, climate change has directly influenced the ability to grow food and to maintain sustainable livelihoods. So this can really help with adaptation as well. Next slide. We also know there's a ton of research on this, that meeting women's needs for family planning and reproductive health also benefits climate adaptation. And the reasons for this are pretty straightforward. So whenever women gain access to healthcare, they become healthier. That's a fundamental aspect of building climate resilience. Healthier women are also more empowered to engage in adaptation and mitigation efforts. At the broader, more population level, unintended pregnancies drop whenever women have access to this resource, meaning that less people are exposed to climate impacts and less sort of pressures are put on the environment. And over time, this slows population growth, which, as we know, yields a variety of social, economic, and environmental benefits to society. Next slide. And in terms of climate change mitigation, increasing access to reproductive health and education has the potential to be extremely impactful. So on this slide, you're going to see the top 5 solutions to climate change, again, put forth by Project Drawdown, which, if you don't know by now, is a nonprofit dedicated to producing ongoing research on the potential effectiveness of various climate interventions. And they've argued that health and education, meeting the global unmet need for both health and education, would result in emissions reductions of up to 85 gigatons of CO2 by 2050, which for scale is equivalent to permanently removing over 22,000 coal-fired power plants. This organization also ranks different solutions based off of various indicators like upfront cost or return on investment or potential emissions offsets. And they do this in line with meeting the Paris Agreement goals, either 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And I bring this up because they rank health and education second out of 82 different solutions for its potential efficacy overall. So it's a really, really compelling solution, of course, in terms of human rights and the expansion of women's empowerment, but also in terms of climate change mitigation. These things are very intertwined and connected. Next slide. All right. So the connections between population growth, demographic trends, and the environment are numerous. Our global population has grown incredibly quickly in a relatively short amount of time, and this alone is a challenge. And of course, this puts real strain on the environment, absolutely. But studying population also shows us that many of these challenges that we're facing are self-imposed and the reflection of a specific geopolitical and economic system, which views growth through the endless consumption of goods and services and a risky dependence on fossil fuels for energy. Climate change now impacts every stage of human development. And as we work to develop solutions to this massive problem that we seem to have gotten ourselves into, I think it's clear that we cannot approach climate change as solely an environmental issue in isolation. So as we wrap up here, I want to really emphasize the intimate connections between people and the planet. Reproductive rights and healthcare are not separate from the environment, and they are not separate from climate change. As environmentalists, we need to understand these connections more deeply. To be an environmentalist is to care about the environment for sure. But beyond that, environmentalism must encompass humans. Humans are not separate from nature. We are nature. We are animals, and we are part of a much bigger, more complex, and more brilliantly ordered ecological system than we realize. When we start looking at things in this way, it becomes easier to see that the very same systems of oppression that work to exploit people also destroy the environment and perpetuate climate change. When we can see that poverty and high fertility and exploitation and gender inequality are the byproducts of a system that also pollutes our water and our air and destroys our forests and our oceans, we know that reproductive justice is intimately connected to the climate crisis at all levels. This is a global problem that requires systemic change. And, there are a lot of unknowns here about what the future will look like. But one thing is for certain, and that's when we work to uphold and expand human rights, we are fighting the climate crisis. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Hannah. That was wonderful, as always. I always like seeing what you come up with for these presentations. It's always a surprise, and I like it that way. So we did get a lot of questions that were submitted in advance, but before we get to those, I did want to ask just a couple of questions that people brought up during the presentation because they're pertinent to things that you said. And one of them is something, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this question, and we've kind of been chatting about it amongst the communications team during your presentation. It's unclear to all of us. Somebody asked, why is Mongolia higher than the US in per capita CO2 emissions? Do you know the answer to that?
Man, I put this map on the PowerPoint
this is going to happen.
And I knew it was going to happen because I also was like, what is that about? It must have to do with oil. And I think that CO2 per capita is included somehow in the country's overall use of an extraction of oil. But that's something that I meant to look up and verify. So great question. I want to know the answer to, and I'll look up and verify that. But it must have to do with oil.
All right. We'll do some research and get back to you when we send the follow-up email. And then another question that came up during the presentation was, if efforts were focused on eliminating poverty to reduce the fertility rate, would that increase greenhouse gases to such a point as to make the world a mess due to climate change and make everyone's ability to live much harder? So I guess the question is, as the fertility rate goes down, per capita emissions go up, and won't that be a disaster for the climate?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think a common one that comes up whenever we're looking at the connections between population and the environment. And, it's a fair thing to look at and consider. I think that we're at a stage now globally where wealth disparities are so drastic that even despite, the various countries that people are living in, there's a huge disparity even within countries amongst super mega wealthy people and everybody else. And the vast majority of the world's population is not consuming resources at any level even near as close as the highest emitters. Conversely, the highest emitters, the richest people on the planet, people making more than I think $100,000 a year on average, are the very highest consumers. So the disparity is such that recent studies have shown that increasing helping people to transcend poverty, people living on less than $1.90 a day, would only, raise global emissions by like 1% or something. So this conversation has a lot to do, it's really complicated, and it has a lot to do with the way that resources are being used, who's consuming them, where, and wealth disparities. Also, this conversation must include the very dire need to shift our economic practices away from fossil fuels, away from extractive industry, away from industrialized agriculture, and these processes that are killing the planet, right? It's really not fair that certain countries have already industrialized and now everybody else is trying to industrialize amidst climate change, which was caused by the early industrializers, right? So we need to figure out a way forward that's equitable and more sustainable. This system, for all of its benefits and innovations, has proven to, be detrimental to human rights and to the environment. So it's something that we need to change at the systemic level as well.
Yeah, and it is complicated because, you mentioned commercial agriculture, and of course, the only reason why the planet can sustain 8 billion people is because we have commercial agriculture. And if we were all subsistence farmers, we wouldn't be able to have this many people alive right now. So it's tricky.
Yeah, it's interesting too, that conversation as well, because through industrialized agriculture, there's like many things to be said about it. One, it's so environmentally unsustainable that even though it's producing more food, it's taking food away from future generations, if that makes sense, because it's destroying the environment to such an extent and so deeply that food cannot be produced in this way for very long. And also, a lot of the food that's produced through industrialized agriculture is actually corn, genetically modified corn, that's given to cattle and livestock. So even though we have the capacity to feed everyone on the planet, we could definitely do that even today. We're not, because we're not distributing it equitably. So yeah, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot too, the sort of implications of agriculture, because we need to be able to produce higher yields. That's something that the Green Revolution has really helped with, and it has allowed our population to grow. But it's unsustainable. So.
Right. This actually, that point feeds into this next question, which is solving environmental issues as well as many political conflicts is dependent on stabilizing population, yet this isn't part of public discussions of climate change, species extinction, pollution, waste disposal, et cetera. How do we get the media to become more aware of and discuss this very important issue? And the reason why it's related to what you just said is that I don't know how many people saw the article that came out a few days ago in the Atlantic, I think the end of last week. And it was a long article talking about how it was one of these like population denier articles, basically, about how like the Green Revolution solved everything and there's nothing to worry about. Yeah, you're the one that sent it around to the entire staff. And we had our new communications manager, Olivia Nader, who's on this call. We had her write a letter to the editor in response, kind of unpacking this point about the Green Revolution, that yes, we can feed more people now, but it's wrecking the environment. And the father of the Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, has said himself that, it was a short-term fix, and that the Green Revolution was no match for population growth, and that we're still going to have to contend with the unsustainability of trying to produce this amount of food for future generations. So anyway, so that's kind of that's a little bit of an answer to that question, which is, how do we get the media to become more aware of these issues? Boy, do we try. I mean, whenever an article like that comes out, we get right on it and we send a letter to the editor. Sometimes they're published. More often than not, they aren't published. But we are always trying to get reporters to be more aware of population issues and to know how to talk about them in a sensitive and human rights-based way. I don't know if you have anything else to say about that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's something that it doesn't make any sense, because we need to be talking about these issues and population growth and demographic shifts and population momentum and everything we've been talking about. It's so intimately related to every global challenge we face that it seems ridiculous not to include it. And I think that there's a real sensitivity and aversion to talking about population as it relates to climate change and the environment. Because of histories of population control measures and structural impositions that attempt to control fertility, and that's completely valid. And I think it speaks to the fact that our work is super important in terms of how we approach the issue, the language we use, and implications of what we're saying for marginalized communities, which is of course who we're ultimately talking about here. At-risk populations. So it needs to be approached carefully, but this is something that, we have to address as a global society. We have to look at the intersection between population health and the environment. We cannot solve climate change by continuing to exploit people, by continuing to deny women basic human rights, by continuing to just do things as we've been doing them. That has caused the problem. So we need to include humans in the solution as well.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, that the media does fairly often cover is the contribution of population growth to various challenges. What it doesn't then go on to do is talk about the solution being anything population related, So I'm just thinking recently when the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its report on mitigation. And so it was, I forget how many, 2,700 pages of mitigation strategies for climate change. And, population growth, of course, is one of the primary inputs for all of their projections going forward, different scenarios of what carbon emissions will be in the future. And even though it was a report about mitigation, solutions, not once did the report mention any solutions related to population growth, even though population growth and economic growth are the two factors that go into those models. And that to me was about as stark as it gets,
Yeah. And I think that there's ways to talk about it from a human rights perspective, and we need to be. It makes sense. I mean, I even mentioned in the presentation, places like India, places like China. I mean, forced sterilization is not something that we have to, look at as a past issue. This is something that's happening today, right now. People are being forcefully sterilized today, So I think that it makes sense to be very sensitive about the way that we approach it, and to make sure that we're not advocating that governments impose population control measures, or there's real weight to what we say and to how we say it, and so I think that needs to be taken into consideration. But there's ways to do it, and we need to be better about figuring that out, because it's really vital to our survival as a species.
Indeed. So somebody wrote in beforehand, can you touch on the 2.1 replacement level? Is this constant for all countries and conditions? Is that something you want to answer?
So replacement level fertility, just the definition is it sort of infers population stabilization, because the average children per woman within a country is 2.1, just above 2, which would replace the 2 parents. So over time, population doesn't continue to grow as it would if the fertility rate was 3 or higher. It stabilizes. That's something that indicates, again, population stabilization, and it's not experienced across the board. If that's what you were asking, it very much depends on the country.
I think, well, I'm not sure. I think the question might be more about, is replacement rate fertility 2.1 everywhere? And I think the answer to that is no, because it depends on it depends on survival. It depends on child and infant survival. So in countries where there's a low mortality of young people, yes, 2.1 is considered replacement rate fertility. And the reason why it's just over 2 is because even in a low mortality society, not everybody will reach adulthood and reach their own reproductive years. And so that 0.1 sort of adjusts for that. But in places where infant and child mortality is really high and a lot of people are not expected to make it to their own reproductive years, replacement rate fertility can be as high as like 3.5, I've read. And I actually—
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
I grabbed a link to this beforehand because I saw these questions beforehand. So if anybody's interested in reading a paper from 19 years ago on this topic, that link will take you there. And it just talks about, the variation in placement rate in different fertility settings. I think that's a good question I was asking. And then this is also something that I had to look up beforehand, so I can't imagine that you just know off the top of your head. But the question is, could you provide a detailed demographic breakdown for the US procreating population? And then in parentheses, age, racial, economic, religion, geographic, cultural, educational, etc., or a source to find that information.
Oh, that's another good question. I think it definitely relates to socioeconomic status, because we are an industrialized country, which means that our fertility rates overall are lower because, as we were talking about, more women are going to school, marrying later, having less children overall. But as we're all well aware, unfortunately, reproductive rights are under attack throughout the whole country, and in particular in specific states that also have really high rates of unintended pregnancies, teen pregnancy rates, and poverty. So fertility rates in these regions are higher than the average, or higher than like urbanized areas. And I don't know, Marian, do you want to follow up on that?
Well, I wonder if what they were asking is like how many people are in their childbearing ages in the US. And if that's the question, what I looked up is that there are 64 million women ages 15 to 44, according to the latest census. And then here's a link to a load of census information if this question asker wants to look at the like racial breakdown and the geographic breakdown of all of that. I think that's the question, but I could very well be wrong. Let us know if that's not right. Okay, and then this question comes up pretty much every single time we do one of these, and it always comes up in response to the magazine issues that we send out. How can we encourage men to take more responsibility in discussions of population growth and family planning?
Yeah, I mean, men need to be included, absolutely. They are, you know, an essential part of the conversation and the movement towards progress. I think that there is a big movement to do that, especially in countries that are trying to, you know, lower their fertility rates and slow population growth. Uganda and Rwanda are good examples of this. Both countries, especially Rwanda, has invested really heavily in healthcare and education and has invested in what are called community health workers, which are government supported and trained healthcare people who go out to rural and urban places and provide family planning services, and also very intentionally include men in the process. So whenever a woman has a child, both the woman and the man are given counseling on what family planning education is and kind of the importance or the benefits associated with smaller families, not in a coercive way, but just as an educational platform for people to access to help confront these cultural barriers, right? Because I think ultimately it's not even advantageous to have a lot of children, no matter where you are, even if it's not that expensive, because if there's no resources and if there's limited resources, then population pressures really exacerbate that issue. And then, you know, all across the world, I think it needs to be approached in a geographically specific way because there are cultural implications to all of it. But I think that, you know, reproductive rights organizations and organizations like ours should be really working to include the voices of men in conversations surrounding family planning.
Yeah. And I think one of the perennial frustrations, at least in the United States, is just the lack of options for male contraception. I mean, obviously there are condoms and there's vasectomy, and that's it. And, you know, the old hardy har joke is male contraception is always 2 years away. Like that's been the case since the 1970s. People have been saying, oh, in a couple of years we'll have it, and we still don't. That's not to say that researchers haven't been working on it. I mean, you know, you gather all of these news clips each day and send around these articles. And there have recently been articles about human trials beginning, I think, later this year in Australia, maybe, about for one form of potential male contraception. And then there's a non-hormonal, like something that is like a vitamin A receptor inhibitor or something. So there are, you know, researchers are trying to come up with hormonal and non-hormonal reversible methods of birth control for men, but nothing is ready for the market yet. And, you know, I'm sure a lot of people remember a few years ago now when there were human trials for like a gel, like a topical gel for men, and they had to shut the study down because the men who were involved in the study complained so much about side effects, which, you know, of course the media had a field day with because of what women have historically put up with in terms of side effects. But yeah, there just isn't, you know, there's a permanent method of birth control for men, and then there's like a very, you know, one-off method. So it's not ideal.
Yeah. It needs to change. I feel like it can.
Yeah. Okay, there are a couple of questions. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but the last two questions are kind of about the same thing. People are wondering about the situation happening right now with Roe v. Wade about to be overturned in the United States. One person is asking about the economic impact of denying women their right to abortion. And I don't know do you know about the Turnaway study? That's what I was going to mention, if not.
I'm not sure about the Turnaway study, but that's a great question and something that's been covered recently in the news, as well as the economic impact of abortion bans, which they are significant. but I'll let you speak to the
Yeah, well,
study.
there's a study called the Turnaway Study that looked at, I think, about 1,000 women across the country in like 2008 to 2010, women who sought abortions and either were just able to get their procedures because they were under the gestational limits where they lived, or were turned away because they were over the gestational limits. And so these researchers followed women who were in both of those situations. So women who ended up having babies that they had tried to have terminations for back when they were pregnant, and just kind of followed them for several years afterwards to see how they were doing. And there are a lot of different papers that have come out of this study, and one of them is specific to the financial situation of the women who were not able to get the abortions that they had wanted. And I'm going to drop that in the link, or that link in the chat right now. But yeah, what that study found was that unpaid debts that are 30 or more days past due more than doubled in size for women who were turned away. And the number of public records, which include negative events such as evictions and bankruptcies, increased substantially. The financial impact extended through the sample period, with negative effects observed up to 4 years after the birth. Women who were denied an abortion were significantly less likely to have a prime credit score in the 2 years following the birth, and it goes on and on and on. So if you're actually interested in reading more about that, check out that paper. But the Turnaway Study itself, that where that data came from, is right there. And it's fascinating. Yeah. It's really worth looking into.
That is, I would like to read that too. And yeah, I mean, the economic implications of abortion bans are not positive at all, primarily because, abortion bans really affect already marginalized populations who are often struggling financially as well, often don't have the means to travel to seek care elsewhere. And because of that, their economic sort of influence is hindered through abortion bans. Their overall health is impeded, which impacts their sort of productivity within the workforce, and so on. I mean, it's like also education rates fall as women are having children earlier now because abortion is no longer an option. It's pretty obvious, and I think that the implications are really well documented around the world, but for some reason we're returning to the Stone Ages.
It does seem so obvious that
ridiculous.
People know best for themselves what they should do in their lives as opposed to somebody else knowing better, but here we are.
Abortion
check
bans,
back with us in a month after the Supreme Court issues its final ruling.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be laughing. It's not funny. It's terrible.
It's terrible.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're out of time. Stephanie, I don't know if you want to hop back on here and say anything about upcoming events or anything like that. Here you are.
Hi. Yes, Marianne. Thank you. Well, happy June, everyone, first of all. And we do have a lineup of events coming up starting next week, actually, with our very own Hannah. She will be presenting with some of our partners from Transition Earth for a presentation to commemorate World Environment Day. So in the wrap-up email, which includes the link to this recording, the presentation slides, the chat box discussion, and any questions we did not get to today will be the registration link for next week's presentation. So stay tuned, look out for that email. We will be in touch with more information. And thank you all for joining us and for participating in this series. It has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, take care. Bye.